Elderly woman banned from store. Cops check security footage and… Julia, 92, was devastated when she was asked to leave her favorite grocery store, but she wasn't going to take it lying down. The manager was unaware of her true capabilities and abilities, and she had no trouble demonstrating that to him. So Julia came ready when she came back a few days later. The manager of the store would soon understand that he'd made a serious error. Augustine, the general manager of the supermarket, never anticipated seeing Julia again. He'd felt forced to do it even though he hadn't wanted to. After it was finished, he simply wanted to put it behind him. However, he wouldn't be able to do that indefinitely. A few days later, Julia unexpectedly made her way back. She wasn't alone either. Augustine wanted to stop her from coming in at first, but he soon realized that wasn't going to be possible. What was this elderly woman going to do? Augustine didn't fully understand his error until Julia revealed to him who she really was. He ought to have never barred Julia from the shop. But who is Julia in reality? Why was Augustine's decision to forbid her from the store such a mistake, and why did he make the decision in the first place? When Julia did have some free time, she went to the grocery store. Julia didn't have a lot of free time. She felt relaxed as she browsed the aisles and picked up a new toy to bring home even though she didn't need it. Additionally, it gave her a chance to get some fresh air and walk around outside of her property. To the best of Julia's knowledge, she was invisible during every trip to everyone else in the store. She would quickly discover that this presumption was entirely incorrect. She was unaware that the floor manager of the store was keeping a close eye on her. The floor manager just couldn't get rid of the feeling that Julia was acting strangely. There was something strange about the way she spent hours perusing the shelves and almost always left with nothing. He knew she might just be another one of those annoying customers who frequent his store and act like they own it. No matter how closely he watched her, he was unable to come up with a good enough excuse to fire her. He couldn't explain it to the general manager because she wasn't particularly loud or disruptive. All he knew was that this woman kinda gave him the creeps, and he was sick of seeing her wander the store, stopping infuriatingly in the middle of the aisles to consider grains and canned goods. The floor manager knew this wasn't necessarily the best course of action, but he was in a tight spot and needed to find a way to permanently remove Julia from his store. No one would ever be banned by his manager unless it was for a serious offense like shoplifting. He was aware that she'd never do it. All he had to do was take matters into his own hands. The floor manager made the decision to pull the prank the day after she arrived. After a few days, she hadn't materialized. She entered the sliding doors in the early afternoon on the final day, just as he was beginning to think he might have just manifested her disappearance. Time had come. He approached Julia and gave her his best and brightest customer service smile as he watched her begin a routine inspection of the pantry items. He chirped, "Hello, can I help you find something?" When Julia finally realized he was speaking to her, she turned to face him but was unmoved by his offer. Julia gave him a brief moment of attention before slowly walking up the aisle and waving him off, muttering, "No thank you," and moving on as usual to the next aisle. He snuck up behind her and cunningly placed a small pricey bottle of alcohol inside her bulky tote bag. "Okay, well, I'll be here if anything comes to mind," he said as he passed her. He was eagerly awaiting her attempt to flee. The floor manager flitted to his boss after she finished her rounds, eager for what lay ahead. He pulled him aside dramatically and pretended to be deeply concerned while mentioning that he'd seen an old woman smuggle a bottle into her purse. He even had the audacity to call her crazy. The floor manager's boss, Augustine, averted his eyes at the exaggerated tale. Even though the floor manager was constantly complaining about the customers, it was still his responsibility to investigate whether these claims were accurate. As Julia was buying her afternoon snack, he moved toward the cashier. Augustine stopped Julia as she approached the door and kindly inquired as to whether she'd fulfilled her needs for the day. She appeared a little confused by the conversation but assured Augustine that her shopping went smoothly. He inquired further about her journey, wondering if she might have taken something that wasn't rightfully hers. It was time to get right to the point because he could see Julia starting to become a little agitated. Gentlemanly, Augustine said, "Ma'am, do you mind if I peek inside your bags? It won't take very long." Fully agitated, Julia scoffed. "Why would that be required? I only made one purchase. I also have a receipt." She waved a wrinkly hand with a receipt in front of him. He sighed. "Well, to be honest, we received a tip that you may have placed something in your bag there that you didn't purchase. I need to go through it right away." Julia felt the charge to be offensive. She was a dependable client. Why would she ever attempt to rob a business she frequently visited? She didn't resist the inspection, though. After a brief pause, she even encouraged it because she was sure she had nothing to conceal. However, Augustine quickly made the alcohol bottle she'd hidden in her bag visible. Her mouth gaped in shock. "That's not possible. I didn't even glance at the booze. There's probably a mistake here. I don't even drink," she cried out, but Augustine remained stationary. He explained he couldn't make an exception for her because they had a zero-tolerance policy for theft. She was prohibited from the store starting that day. Julia was horrified. She was hearing things she couldn't believe. The floor manager was giddy and a few feet away. He was finally free of this woman who followed him around his shop like a ghost, but Augustine wasn't as content. He wished he could have chosen another course of action instead of banning her because it broke his heart to see how upset she was, but it simply wasn't feasible. Julia begged Augustine, saying that this was one of her preferred shops. Because it was so close to her house, she walked here almost every day. It was a crucial component of her daily routine. Augustine steadfastly refused to budge. Julia was devastated. How is it possible that she's experiencing this? She sulked, feeling defeated, and headed for the door. The last thing she anticipated dealing with today was this. Something struck her as she prepared to leave the store for what might be the final time. She wasn't guilty of anything. She wasn't going down without a fight either. Her normally kind eyes were ablaze as she turned to face Augustine. "Oh, this isn't done yet. I'll be back soon, but trust me, when I am, you won't like it," she growled. But Augustine didn't think for a second that her threat would come true. She was an elderly lady. When she got home, she'd give up. With vengeance on her mind, Julia made her way down the street to her home. She wasn't going to stand by and let them get away with pushing her out in that way. The day dragged on back at the store, all the excitement having left with Julia. Since there weren't many customers throughout the day, Augustine's thoughts were unnecessarily drawn to Julia. Did he act ethically? Was it possible that she was telling the truth because she appeared to be so certain she hadn't stolen anything? He expressed his skepticism to the floor manager, but he didn't get the response he was hoping for. The floor manager actually appeared ecstatic that Julia would never come back to the store. It was an odd response, but Augustine made an effort not to think about it too much. Maybe his own guilt was causing him to read too much into things. Julia never would have expected to defend herself in such a strong manner, especially given how elderly and frail she appeared to be. This lady couldn't possibly be any younger than 85, but she had the spirit of a person half her age. The floor manager and Augustine would soon come to regret their role in tearing Julia away from her favorite store. The following few days at the store went by largely without incident. Augustine felt a great sense of relief that Julia had not reverted to showing her face. He didn't want to engage in that argument again. He detested having to debate with his clients. He had a tendency to appreciate the best in people. The floor manager basically went on a power trip because he seemed to enjoy the argument. He demanded a store ban on anyone who made too few purchases or spent too much time there. The floor manager was a very cunning individual who was very different from Augustine. There were a lot of shoppers at the store, but there were also many people living in the alleys every day. Although the majority of them didn't visit the store frequently, they did like to leisurely look around. The floor manager wanted everyone out of there. He was an awful person. The floor manager wanted to make sure that all the customers who were slow and made few purchases would be banned from the store as soon as possible. He was aware it would be challenging to persuade Augustine to forbid more people. He began formulating a number of strategies to help him accomplish his objectives, but then something unexpected occurred. A group of police officers arrived at the store before it even opened one morning, 5 days after Julia was asked to leave. When Augustine opened the door after arriving, he was petrified to death. What were these police officers doing inside the shop? Was a robbery taking place? The officers entered the store quickly without saying anything, and the ostensible squad leader immediately displayed his badge. Before forcing Augustine to take them upstairs, he added that Julia sent them. Fortunately, there was no connection to a robbery, but Augustine was taken aback that Julia had dispatched the agents. As the officers carried out their duties and then left once more, giving the manager little to no information about what they were doing and what they discovered, Augustine watched on in awe. Additionally, the manager wasn't entirely sure why the agents had come. They looked at a few things and then very quickly left again. Only 15 minutes later, as other employees began to enter the store, they left once more. Augustine had to explain what happened because some people had still seen the officers leave. The police officers shocked the staff members quite a bit. They believed the store was experiencing something bad. The employees bombarded Augustine with inquiries, but all he actually knew was that they had allegedly arrived because Julia sent them, and that before they left, they'd promised to return. On his computer, he hadn't even noticed what they were doing. Augustine spent the rest of the day attempting to determine what had occurred that morning and why. Even though the floor manager hurriedly approached to inquire further, he remained in his office. There was no doubt that Augustine was unhappy with the circumstances. Police interactions with the store were always positive. He changed his strategy when he was unable to determine how the police had checked that morning. How could a senior citizen like Julia organize a large police force to obtain a search warrant to search his store? Normally, the police would schedule a meeting, correct? No police station ought to ever show enough concern over an elderly woman who's prohibited from entering a grocery store for any reason, even someone who's been barred for allegedly shoplifting. Did they not have more important things to take care of? Julia had to possess a unique quality. Did she perhaps have any connections to the police force? There had to be a problem with Julia for this to have happened. Augustine was confident that the police would not immediately respond to his store ban for an elderly woman. He made an effort to consider every potential explanation. He was unable to understand. Augustine searched for information about her on Google all afternoon, but he found nothing. He returned home feeling let down and still very perplexed. He gave Julia and the police's situation all of his attention that evening, but he'd have all the answers he needed by tomorrow. The same group of police officers arrived at the store at almost the same time as the previous morning. This time, Augustine was not as shocked that they'd stopped by. He'd already considered this scenario, but there weren't 4 of them this time. They'd brought a special guest with them. She was immediately recognized by Augustine. Julia was with them this time, grinning as if she already knew what was going to happen next. Why was she permitted to accompany policemen? This seemed odd to Augustine. On these types of visits, police officers never bring just anyone with them. The squad commander requested a meeting with Augustine in his office. Augustine had hoped for a prompt explanation, but the officers informed him they had to wait for one more person to show up, the floor supervisor. Augustine didn't comprehend why the agents were unable to communicate him without the floor manager present. He was forced to call him, though. Augustine gave him a call right away. He invited the floor supervisor to visit the office as soon as he could. He informed him the agents had returned and they preferred not to disclose anything in the absence of the floor manager. After 10 minutes, the door swung open. The floor manager turned as red as a cherry when he saw the police waiting for him and struggled to speak. Fortunately, he didn't need to. The squad leader intended to speak only when necessary. The floor manager started to experience severe anxiety. The police began describing why they were there, mentioning that he was Julia's grandson. This clarified the reason why Julia was permitted to attend this visit. She'd been furious about the incident and vowed she hadn't stolen anything or put the alcohol in her bag. They'd come in the morning before for him to check the security footage from that day at the store, so he'd called in a few favors with the station to get permission. He was curious as to what had actually occurred. After all, he trusted what Julia told him because he was a grandson. They found video footage quickly and downloaded it as proof that the floor manager had in fact placed the bottle in Julia's carry-on bag. They returned to the station with a slander case ready when they arrived. They gave Julia the option to accompany them and she did so. Unless Julia was permitted back into the store starting that day and the floor manager was fired, they were going to pursue the case, and Augustine was delighted to comply. He detested learning that his floor manager in whom he put his trust had committed such an act. He immediately fired his employee because he was so disappointed in him. The floor manager was unable to criticize it in any way. He recognized his mistake and understood that he'd gone way too far. He shouldn't have taken this action. Julia was given full access to the store and was free to take as much time as she wanted starting that day. She had no animosity toward Augustine because he was only carrying out his duty. The store was largely returning to normal, albeit with a new floor manager, and Julia gets along just fine with him.